Hello, everyone. Today we are going to be going over the dietary guidelines for Americans. Now, normally I don't need to really update this slideshow just because we don't see or haven't really seen much variability between the dietary guidelines over the last few releases. However, this new release is a little more significant in the changes that have been made, which is why we are doing an updated version of this slideshow. So before we get into what those changes look like, I first want to go over a brief history of the dietary guidelines for Americans. Now, our book says that 1940 was the first set of guidelines. Really, though, we do see even earlier looser guidelines, I would say, at the beginning of the 20th century. This started with an American chemist who studied nutrition. His name was W.O. Atwater, and he saw the importance that balance and moderation had for health. And so he had food groups that were part of this first set of guidelines, which included fruits and vegetables, meats and other protein-rich foods, cereals and other starchy foods, sweets, and fatty foods. All right, so that was part of that first 1894 set of guidelines. And really, we saw, based on this statement from Atwater, today's principles and principles that we talk about in this class, such as the importance of balance, moderation, and variety, and why balance, moderation, and variety are important for maintaining good health and preventing things like chronic disease. Now, in 1920, again, we see the government stepping in as far as messaging around food. However, instead of from a disease standpoint, we really see this from more of a foodborne illness standpoint. We started to see more individuals getting sick from foodborne illnesses. And so we really, or the government, I should say, really started to focus messaging around food storage and safety in order to prevent these foodborne illnesses. Now, in 1941, this is where we'll pick up with our book. We have our creation of the Food and Nutrition Board, who then released a more official set of guidelines, I guess we could say. This was created in response to World War II troops. You can read about that more in the textbook. Now, these guidelines first were around what they were calling the Basic Seven as far as food groups. They then simplified this to be called the Basic Four. And there was a strong focus on preventing common nutritional deficiencies like calcium, vitamins A and D, as well as iron. And that's something that we do still see today. So trying to address those deficiencies, but also in the case of our more modern guidelines, trying to prevent chronic disease. Now, around 1977, we saw what was known as the McGovern Report being released. This is where the US Senate reported that there was a link, or there was an observed link through studies between things with high sugar, salt, cholesterol, and fat, and the relationship that they had to the development of certain cardiovascular diseases. So this is where we see the modern dietary guidelines that we have today. So really, we can say that those started in the 1980s. We have this guidance that was influenced by a Surgeon General's report on health prevention, health promotion and disease prevention. And this in turn guided what we currently practice, in that we have experts who first weigh in on the guidelines before the actual release. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. In the 1992 version, we started to see the image of what was known as the food pyramid. These previous versions also had images that were released to them, but I want to focus more on today's, the more modern of the guidelines. So that's why we're starting here with the food pyramid era. That lasted about until 2005. In 2011, we saw the creation of My Plate. And then today we see the inverted food pyramid. And we're going to look more at those images and what the differences were between those different guidances. Before we look at those images, though, I do want to give us just a basic overview about what exactly the dietary guidelines are. So these are released every 5 years by the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the U.S. Department for Agriculture. These reports are based primarily upon disease prevention. So again, we've seen a shift in the purpose of these dietary guidelines. It influences things like school lunch programs as well as how foods are labeled. Also, this is something that individuals like physicians, nurse practitioners, really anyone in the medical field can rely upon when they are trying to give information to their patients. Obviously, this is also for just the general public as well, which that's something I'm going to tap into when we talk about our current and new guidelines and just some observations that I've made there. Now, one interesting thing that I would like to note here is the fact that the USDA is also in charge of keeping the meat industry in business. And so it's been interesting to see how political lobbying has played a role when it comes to our dietary guidelines, which is what we'll talk about here. So when we are talking about the dietary guidelines, there are two different steps involved when creating these guidelines. First, we have a scientific report that's created. This is created by a collection of experts in disease prevention and nutrition. So we see individuals such as physicians, dietitians, etc., who are weighing in on this scientific report. Now, the purpose of the report is to provide guidance in creating the actual dietary guidelines for Americans. Now, the dietary guidelines for Americans, it's going to have more political figures who are creating these guidelines. So it's not necessarily individuals in the medical field who create the guidelines themselves. So again, the scientific report informs the guidelines, but those individuals who are informing the guidelines are not the ones who are actually creating it. And I just want to pull up the guidelines so that you can see, and the report, just so that you can see the difference between the two. So this is the scientific report that was created for this round of dietary guidelines. If we scroll down, let's see. We scroll down here, we can see that this was created by, again, doctors, individuals who have a master's in public health, individuals who are accredited in dietetics, etc. And this is quite an extensive report. I'll just go back up to the table of contents so that you can see what all is included. As you can see, it is a 400-page document. They really go into detail when it comes to things such as what should be included in an American diet to prevent disease, what should be limited or excluded. And they also, at least in recent guidelines over the last few rounds, they've also talked about things like determinants of health, health equity. All of that has been included within the scientific report. Now, I would say the last two rounds of dietary guidelines, again, it's not a perfect reflection of the advisory committee. Part of that really has to do with lobbying and interest groups, right? So if you've taken a class revolving around politics and government in this country, we see how the role of lobbying really can influence what our policies look like. And that also is included in these dietary guidelines for Americans. Now, in the past, what that has looked like is, for instance, this topic of red meat. So in the past, we've seen where red meat isn't necessarily frowned down upon, but it's also not really given a lot of attention. And that's been a criticism of health experts from past guidelines, is that it's been a little wishy-washy when it comes to red meat. Ideally, we would want more strong language around red meat and the role that it can play in cardiovascular disease, in the creation of cardiovascular disease, sorry. And other things like sugar sweetened beverages, in past guidelines, there wasn't really strong language, or really any language at all about sugar sweetened beverages. the last round and this round, I think, do a much better job. And that's something that we have really celebrated in the health community when talking about these guidelines. Okay, so now I want to quickly just jump over to the actual dietary guidelines for Americans for this round. Again, I'll talk about this in more detail. I just wanted to note we see that this is only a 10-page document. Um, so really, that scientific report is a lot more detailed than the actual dietary guidelines. And we see that consistently with past dietary guidelines too. This one in particular, though, is much shorter. Again, I'll talk about that more in a few slides, but I just wanted to give us a general overview of what the difference between the report and the guidelines is. So going back to our slideshow here. I wanted to go over the evolution of the dietary guidelines, starting with the 90s and our food pyramid era. So this in 1990, this is where we first started to see what was known as the food pyramid. And we can see here that there is clear distinction between the different groups. Now, in the past, in the 90s, they said that most of our makeup of our meals should comprise of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta. That has since changed, as we know. And then we can see vegetables and fruit servings were the next that should be emphasized, and so forth. Then in 2005, we have what was known as the My Pyramid. So I personally grew up first with this and then with the My Pyramid. As you can see with the My Pyramid, again, keeping the pyramid structure, they wanted to also have the importance of exercise included within the My Pyramid. Hence why we have this graphic showing that physical activity is important, because that was something that was not represented here in the food pyramid, because it's not just about diet alone, right? We also need to incorporate exercise for good health. I will say with this food pyramid, I don't think it's as clear as this one, the 90s one, to be honest. I think the visualization for this one is a little messy. And at least with this one, it gave the amount of servings that they recommend. This one, there's nothing indicating that. You have to look closely at how they break down the pyramid. So again, this one, honestly, a little messy and a little confusing. Now, in 2010 is when we shifted over to what was known as My Plate. So with this one, now I think this one's clear. It was kind of interesting talking with my husband. He actually preferred the 1990s version, which coming from someone who's not versed in health and nutrition, I thought that was interesting. And honestly, I'm curious about your opinion too, and what visualization makes more sense to you. I thought the My Plate one was a good visual. Now, I will say I have the actual dietary guideline for American version of My Plate here. I preferred the Harvard version. I thought it was a little more clear when it came to talking about serving sizes. It also talked about things like oil and fats. And this one, I will say, my critique for this one is that it didn't go into that detail, which again is why in the past when I've gone over dietary guidelines with individuals, I've brought up Harvard's version. Again, it just has more detail in it compared to the 2010 My Plate. But I liked how the plate is more of a relatable image for individuals. I think it helps to really see, okay, so I should be aiming to get about a quarter of my plate having some form of protein in it, about a quarter of my plate grains. I should have more representation of vegetables, etc. Okay, so that one we've had for about the last 15 years is that My Plate visual. That has not changed up until this cycle. So we've decided to go back to the food pyramid and we're calling it an inverted pyramid. And what we mean by that is basically it's the 1990s food pyramid, but flipped upside down. Now, this visualization, again, I don't particularly think it's the most appealing visually. I think it's a little confusing as well, just because how much representation are we supposed to have of these foods? So that's one critique that I have. We'll talk about more critiques here in a second, but as far as just talking visually about what is represented here, another thing, again, 1990s version, I think honestly did the best job of talking about serving sizes. This one doesn't really mention serving sizes at all. Okay, so there has been a lot of talk surrounding these dietary guidelines. First, I do want to start off with some positives because it hasn't been all bad when it comes to these guidelines. First of all, I think they do an excellent job when it comes to the clear language around processed foods. We've seen in past guidelines, they've been a little wishy-washy in talking about processed foods. So again, I celebrate the fact that they really hone in on the topic of processed food in the actual guidelines and talk about how we really need to be focusing on nutrient dense whole foods. So that's something to be celebrated. They're also very clear about added sugars and sugar sweetened beverages. In past guidelines, they've either excluded talking about sugar sweetened beverages altogether, or it's been very limited, despite continuous expert advice in that expert panel. That has been consistent in that expert report for years. And because of political activism, et cetera, it kept not making its way into the actual guidelines. However, with this new set of the dietary guidelines for Americans, they are very clear about added sugar and very clear about sugar sweetened beverages. So again, that's something that I would say is a positive with these new guidelines. Now, as we saw, overall, this is a shorter document. I can see this as honestly a pro and a con. If we're looking at it from a standpoint of a resource that we are trying to give to the medical community or to guide things such as the food lunch program, for instance, I would say that that's maybe more of a con because there just isn't a lot of guidance given and a lot of description given to more specific topics such as when we talk about developmental stages for kids, which I'll go back to the actual guidelines so that we can see what I'm talking about here. So first we have the report or the statement from RFK. And then we start to see just the actual guidelines that are given. Now, in past guidelines, we've seen all this again in more detail. But then the part where it talks about special populations and considerations, there are many pages related to that. Whereas for this, it's really just one page per or less per life stage or consideration. So again, if we are talking about providing this providing this to the medical community or for guiding government programs such as the school lunch program, that might not be super beneficial if I'm being honest. However, if we are talking about just wanting to get this to actual Americans, because after all, the name is the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, I think it is good if we are wanting this to be something that the everyday American is reading. And due to the fact that literacy rates are low, let's face it, our attention spans are also decreasing due to things like social media and technology addiction and scrolling. I think the shorter document might actually be of benefit. It is called the Dietary Guideline for Americans, and so maybe there should be a shift that this is something that is accessible to the everyday American. And maybe there needs to be something else in place for things such as guiding other diet programs, or I should say government programs such as the food lunch program. All right, so those I did want to start with the things that we can celebrate around the guidelines. It isn't all bad. However, there are things that the medical and nutrition community are rightly so raising their eyebrows on. One of them has to do with the strong emphasis on saturated fats. These are known to raise cardiovascular disease. So we see things such as in the guidelines themselves, it talks about the importance of having whole fat milk. Whole fat milk is going to be high in saturated fat. And it was funny because and I'll provide these links and you can see for yourself. If you look between the scientific report and the guidelines, it's almost night and day on some of these topics. Because in the scientific report, it talks about how saturated fat should be limited. Um, and to be honest, the guidelines themselves are a little confusing because it talks about the importance of having whole fat milk, but then it also talks about how we need to limit saturated fat to 10% of our intake. It also talks about red meat and having red meat as part of your meals. Again, that's going to be high in saturated fat. And so, um, it just, some of the information honestly seems contradictory. And I just wonder if this is going to confuse people. Just having a background myself and reading this, going through this guideline, it just was interesting. I don't know if a lot of thought was put through for this final document. Some of the language too kind of goes against the principle of balance in some of the things that it talks about. For instance, this is a direct quote from the guidelines, but it says to prioritize protein foods at every meal. Now, as we are learning in this first week, it's important to have balance in our meals, so we shouldn't prioritize one thing over another. Now, is that exactly what they meant when they were creating the guidelines? I don't know. But again, just if we're to really parse the language, I think it's again can be confusing for individuals. They might think that they need to eat high amounts of meat. And the interesting thing, I was wanting to go into this lecture prepared, which is why I apologize. For the students who are seeing this for the first time in a couple of years, this isn't going to apply to you. But for our first round, I was a little slow in getting out this lecture slide, and I really just wanted to read different opinions on this. I had my own opinion, but I wanted to read other opinions too. And one of them was the comment was, most Americans are already meeting protein guidelines. If anything, they're actually exceeding protein guidelines. And higher protein, yes, it's needed if you're actively strength training, but for most individuals who are leading sedentary lifestyles, prioritizing protein food might not be in their best interests. Okay. And I can see where food companies in the future are going to maximize on this language with the new guidelines by adding more protein to their processed foods. We want to discourage people from consuming processed food, and this isn't going to help if we now are concerned about getting protein. Okay, let's get protein from these protein chips, right? That's not going to be helpful at all. And then finally, I already mentioned this, but this is a shorter document with limited specifics. So it does tell you, okay, you should prioritize this, this, and that, but it doesn't provide guidance then on how necessarily to go about it. That's where previous dietary guidelines, although yes, they were longer in nature, um, they they at least gave more detail about how to practically apply the guidelines. Now, something I just realized I don't have up, but this is something that maybe you can explore on your own. One final critique I have on is on the website itself. So what I showed you is the Dietary Guideline for American report. That's different from the website. Previous websites, I thought they did a better job in being able to navigate the website. I'll provide the website in the class, but this one you have to do a lot of scrolling and visually, sure, it might look pretty, but it's not really practical. Now I'm hoping in a couple years for the students who are watching this lecture in let's say 2027 or 2028 that maybe they've changed the website a little, but right now in 2025, it's just not the cleanest of websites. Okay, anyway, so that's all I have for you with these guidelines. As you can see, there's quite a stark contrast to the last few rounds of dietary guidelines. we'll see how this all ends up shaking out, and if this is going to, let's say, maybe change how we do dietary guidelines in the future. So, with that, thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.